All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Jeremy Benamy from Washington, D.C., J Street president. And thank you all for signing on such short notice for our, I don't like the term emergency briefing, for our instant react briefing to the breaking news of the last 24 hours about President Trump's proposals regarding Gaza. I'm really pleased to be joined by Tal Shalev and Frank Lowenstein. I'll give them a proper introduction in a minute. Just a couple of logistics to get us started. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens if you'd like to ask our panelists questions, and I'll try to sort of sort through them and pose as many of them as possible. We're also recording today's discussion, and it'll be available to rewatch and share on our YouTube channel. And Eliza is going to share a link for that in the chat. Welcome, everybody. This is, to say the least, an extraordinary time in American history, I would say. We are drinking from a fire hose in terms of everything that is happening all around us, whether it is our threats here at home to our democracy and to our government and to the rule of law, whether it relates to Israel and being in the middle of this ceasefire and hoping that we have some way to get from phase 1 to phase 2. This is a moment that I've referred to as where the threat and specter of fascism is actually upon us. It is not just an idle word and an idle threat, but the things that are happening really do threaten the very democratic foundations of our country and of our future. Global stability and the rule of law are under attack. Our government agencies that are representing us in the world, like USAID, are being shuttered. The CIA is being offered buyouts. Law enforcement is being gutted in the FBI and Department of Justice. There is a lot going on, to say the least. And in the midst of all this, we have the comments yesterday and in recent days from President Trump suggesting that the U.S. would support or even actively engage in the displacement of more than 2 million Palestinians from Gaza. I want to emphasize on behalf of J Street just how deeply opposed we are to this proposal. This is absolutely unacceptable legally. It is unacceptable morally. It is a violation of our democratic values as a country. It's a violation of our values as a Jewish people. And I just want to be sure that you know that J Street is your home in the midst of all of this this storm. We will represent your voice loudly and clearly in the halls of Congress, in the Jewish community, and around the world. We're glad to see voices already beginning to speak out in opposition to what the president has proposed, but I would note that the president's ideas were immediately embraced by the farthest reaches of Israel's right wing, and many of them could scarcely believe that their wildest fantasies are being indulged at the various highest levels of American power. But here in the real world, these proposals are causing immense anguish to the families of the hostages still being held in Gaza, because this may threaten the viability of the second stage of the ceasefire. It's being met by a wall of opposition from neighboring countries who have made it very clear that the regional cooperation that's necessary for any post-war planning really does hinge on a realistic pathway to a Palestinian state, not on expulsion. And sadly, I think it is causing Israel a real strategic blunder and a real miss of the tremendous potential for regional normalization that is just hanging out there waiting to be seized. The president said that we need outside-the-box thinking on this issue because nothing we have tried for the past few decades has worked. Well, perhaps one thing that hasn't been tried is actually a serious, comprehensive regional political resolution to this conflict and a meaningful effort to bring Israel the security its people need and the freedom for the Palestinian people that they deserve. So our guests today are going to dive more deeply into all of this. Tal Shalev is the chief political correspondent for the leading Israeli news web portal, Walla News. She's worked as a news editor for Haaretz and also for the international Israeli television network I-24. Frank Lowenstein has served as special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and senior advisor to Secretary of State John Kerry at the Department of State back in the Obama years. He played a key role in 9 months of direct talks between Israelis and Palestinians in 2013 and 14, as well as the Gaza ceasefire negotiations of 2014. Before joining the Obama administration, he was the staff director and chief counsel at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So we couldn't have two better people to join us, and I want to dig right in. Tal, I'm going to start with you. You've been covering Bibi Netanyahu now for the better part of the time he's been back since 2009, nearly 15, 16, 17 years. I can't even keep track of it at this point. I'm curious what your read of last night was. He stood there next to a president who was going even further than he'd ever dreamed of going, and he just had this smile on his face. He was a little bit shown up by the president, which doesn't often happen. And what did you expect from this trip coming in, and what do you think the impact of last night's events are?
Well, hi everyone. I'm sorry that my lighting is so good. I'll try and take care of it later. And I also apologize if my English will be kind of broken. I'm tired, so that might influence my vocabulary. First of all, I want to say that like the first lesson that I learned from yesterday is that we shouldn't be making any predictions into the future, especially not when we talk about President Trump. I mean, for the past few weeks, Israeli commentators and analysts have been raving about this meeting and building expectations for the first meeting between President Trump and Netanyahu. And none of that happened. I mean, no one predicted that show that we got yesterday. It started in the Oval Office, but even, got worse or better as a show in the press conference. And for Netanyahu, I gotta say, it's the savior of his lifetime. Netanyahu reaches this, arrives here, not as his worst point in his career, because he's already recuperated from the 7th of October and kind of rebuilt himself. But just imagine what yesterday would be like if it would be Kamala Harris in the White House. It would not be a good day for Netanyahu. And yesterday basically saved Netanyahu's coalition, at least for the short term ahead. The fact that Trump is raving about transfer and displacement of Gazans basically gives Netanyahu the leverage he needs in order to keep his coalition together, given the threats of Smotrich to bring down the government if the hostage deal moves into phase 2. And before the trip, me personally too, I admit, I was predicting this is Netanyahu's going to have a clash between his coalition and what Trump wants based on the first stage, which, by the way, the fact that the deal was conceived and was concluded did break down part of Netanyahu's coalition. We had Itamar Ben-Gvir leaving, and we all predicted that the next step would be Bezalel Smotrich leaving if it moves after this trip and if it moves to phase 2. I think that at this point, Netanyahu, what President Trump gave Netanyahu is that even if he does move into phase 2, Smotrich cannot leave the government. I mean, he kind of gave the fact that they're talking about displacement gives Smotrich the reason to stay inside the government, even if phase 2 will conclude. That being said, I'm not sure we'll get to phase 2. As you mentioned, even these statements could just jeopardize the continuation of negotiations. And we know that Netanyahu is basically just looking for an excuse for the negotiations to blow up and not to have to fulfill specifically the withdrawal of IDF forces from Gaza and from the Philadelphia corridor. I just want to say one more thing, that for Netanyahu, for me, there was a very big deja vu to January 2020, when President Trump presented the deal of the century. That too was Netanyahu's dream deal. And after the press conference in the same place, by the way, in January 2020, you had Netanyahu supporters dancing in the streets, celebrating the annexation. And Netanyahu's spokesperson saying, okay, we're going to start annexation on Sunday. And then just a few hours later, they had to walk back from those statements, and eventually they had to give up annexation because of the Abraham Accords. I felt very similar. You had huge celebrations yesterday amongst the right-wing politicians in Israel and the influencers in Israel. But here today, when you start listening to how the White House is talking and how Secretary Rubio is talking, they're backtracking, and in many ways, and this is also what some of Netanyahu's people told me. The displacement of Gaza is the annexation of today, of 2020. It's the same. It plays the same role. It's something that Trump, perhaps, again, I'm not predicting, but it could be something that Trump is giving Netanyahu in order to take it away eventually, in exchange for something else.
So Frank, let me turn over to you now in terms of the impact on the deal that's in place, the ceasefire that we're now currently about halfway through phase one. The really focus of everybody leading into this had been, how do we get from phase one to phase two, and what would these meetings mean? You wrote a piece for the J Street Policy Center that I'm going to ask be put in the chat so that people can have a link to it and download it, analyzing exactly what was going into this meeting, what to expect from it, what might come out of it. But I'm willing to bet you didn't have U.S. annexation of Gaza on your bingo card leading into this. So tell us what now this means, this sort of smoke bomb thrown into the middle of the whole process.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. Great to be with all of you today. The first thing I would start off by saying is that there is no universe in which any of this actually happens. The United States is not going to be sending any troops to Gaza Strip. We couldn't force the deportation of 2 million Palestinians, even if we wanted to. The Jordanians will never accept this. The Egyptians will never accept it. And primarily, the people of Gaza will never accept it. So this is not a serious proposal from President Trump in any way, form, or fashion. It does, however, have real world implications and ramifications. And the first of those is, I think we have lost all credibility in the region going forward. I think there was some optimism there after the ceasefire was originally pushed forth by President Trump and his team, that maybe we would be committed to implementation. And that was certainly my mindset when I was working on that memo. I think what we learned from this meeting is that Trump has no intention whatsoever of pressuring Netanyahu to move from phase one to phase two of this deal. And just to be clear, there are some major issues that would need to be resolved substantively on the ground. Hamas is obviously not been eliminated in any way, really, as a fighting force. And so there were always big challenges in my mind, substantively, about how the Israelis were really going to agree to end this war and withdraw the IDF permanently in return for the release of all the hostages when Hamas was still more or less in power. Now the Trump administration, I thought, had adopted some of the Biden plan, which obviously called for an interim transitionary force there to come in from other Arab regions, perhaps a technocratic government. I think they've more or less abandoned all of that. I think at this point, Trump is very much on board with Netanyahu's notion that Hamas, Trump used the word eliminated yesterday, which is, again, not a real world proposition. But nonetheless, it suggests that when Netanyahu does what I expect that he will do, which is to put forth conditions for the transition from phase one to phase two that include things like the complete demilitarization of Gaza, which incidentally Benny Gantz also echoed yesterday. So what Bibi set himself up to do here is to make really unreasonable demands as far as anything Hamas would ever agree to, and then say it's all Hamas's fault when they can't move from phase one to phase two. I think what was really an interesting subtext of all this for me was Trump's comments about annexation, and I really, if you thing with Trump, and I say this as a longtime veteran of American politics, for better or worse, if you keep your eye on the ball here, what he's really talking about when he talks about annexation in 1 month's time, I think he's teeing up the possibility of trading off U.S. acquiescence to annexation of portions of the West Bank to keep Bibi's coalition together, right? So the 42-day period will end. Smotrich has threatened to resign. I don't think Trump wants to go back to war, but I don't think he's going to pressure Bibi for a full IDF withdrawal. So what you could see is just the de facto extension of the ceasefire, which is actually contemplated by the draft that says if negotiations are ongoing after the 42-day period, then the negotiations will continue and the ceasefire will remain in place. So I could see an extended period of time there where we're either at war, nor has the war ended. Perhaps Trump has traded off annexation or something along those lines to mollify Smotrich and that gang, to keep them at least inside the coalition while they continue to drag this out. But I really think the main takeaway from this in terms of Trump and the Saudi normalization is he really destroyed his own grand plan there. The Saudis, I think, if people saw last night, bin Salman came out with a statement basically saying, we demand the creation of a Palestinian state in return for normalization of relations with you. Previously, they had talked about things like a pathway to a Palestinian state. So there was, and perhaps still remains, an option here for Israel to come up with a political solution in Gaza, withdraw the IDF, get the prisoners out, bring in an international force, have some kind of sector, and then have Saudi normalization follow on top of that. I think that's pretty much off the table now, unless they're willing to obviously, agree to a Palestinian state, which they clearly won't do. So I think this was Trump has a lot of crazy things here, and sometimes he just does it to distract, and sometimes he does it so that when he finally agrees to, promote a slightly less crazy policy, that everybody's like, oh, well, that's not so bad. But in this case, I think anybody who's really hoping that you might get pressure from Trump on Netanyahu to transition to phase two so that he could realize his big dreams of Saudi normalization, I just feel like that becomes an ever more remote possibility at this point.
I'm going to want to come back and pick up on the annexation question in the next round, but I think that's a really important thing not to lose track of. Tal, I just wanted to ask you, though, what, in terms of just the reaction to all of this in Israel, and particularly from the opposition, this was asked in our chat, and I know a lot of people have been looking to see, well, who's going to step forward and say this is just a crazy idea? Is there any opposition to this idea being voiced in Israel?
Well, as you know, the Israeli opposition is weak and very much trying to be like Netanyahu and very much trying to suck up to the right all the time. That's mostly true about Benny Gantz, who today put out a statement saying that he welcomes the idea of displacing the Palestinians from Gaza, which is something you wouldn't expect from an opposition leader, but you might expect it from Benny Gantz. Whoever has been following him in the past few years, and specifically in the war, knows that Benny Gantz is not in opposition to Netanyahu. He doesn't have the ability to be in opposition to Netanyahu, whether it's because he's constantly looking for the right-wing vote, or because he really doesn't understand what he's doing, or he doesn't understand the notion. I mean, if you really want to dive into it, one of the reasons we've arrived at this point without any real plan for the day after in Gaza is because Benny Gantz did not deal with it while he was part of the cabinet and he still had influence. I mean, back in November 2023 and December 2023, when President Biden started to float the idea of a ceasefire as part of a regional situation, a regional solution, which would include a revitalized Palestinian Authority in Gaza, Benny Gantz was inside the government. He did not demand to promote it. On the contrary, he adopted Netanyahu's rhetoric about not Fadakhstan and not Hamakhstan in Gaza, and he basically just tried to copycat Netanyahu.
What about Lapid? What about Lapid in the context? Because he's given some very good speeches in the last few months about the Saudi option and normalization.
So I think Lapid was a bit more cautious. He put out a statement early this morning saying that he wants to learn the details. And he took a breath before he actually put out his opinion, which is probably smart from his point of view. And you also have the Yair Golan, who is now, gaining traction, at least in the polls. And he and his party are out there in the open, attacking the plan and attacking the idea of any displacement or annexation. But you should remember, and it's important to remember, President Trump is extremely popular in Israel, even more than he was in the first term. Because in the first term, he was already very popular. Now he's already, even people from the center left are thanking President Trump, for closing the Biden deal for the hostages. So it's also very risky for a politician to attack President Trump internally at this point, and to voice an opposition to it. And of course, this, as Frank mentioned, this basically secures Netanyahu's coalition at this point. Today, you already had Ben Gvir basically asking or begging to run back into the government, just like less than a month after he left. So in that respect, Trump really gives Netanyahu what he needs to for the next year and 9 months till the next election. And while people in Israel were kind of contemplating maybe he'll go to an early election and he'll dissolve the Knesset. It doesn't seem there's any outlook for that right now. Doesn't seem that there needs to be a reason for Netanyahu to give up a year and 9 months with President Trump if he's so supportive.
And somebody put in the Q&A that they saw a poll today that said 72% of Israelis in an overnight poll were in support of what Trump laid out. Is that
true? Listen, well, first of all, Israelis also have a lack of leadership for many, many years. So a lack of leadership telling them even more since the 7th of October. And I think, first of all, if you would instinctively or intuitively ask any Israeli, would you prefer the Palestinians not to be in Gaza? Then they would say yes. If you don't go into the implications of what that means from international law and a war crime, it just instinctively after the 7th of October, yeah, we would be happy if they would. Most Israelis would say they would be happy if the Palestinians would just go away. But there's a lack of leadership. If Benny Gantz adopts the adopts the plan, if Yair Lapid doesn't say anything, then there's no one to explain to the Israelis, wait, dislocation is immoral. Displacement is immoral, and how can you even think about it? Nobody's talking that discourse. So with a lack of leadership, you can understand why the popular opinion is just like this.
we certainly understand that in the American Jewish community, because we have that same exact lack of leadership from the leaders of our established communal institutions who have said nothing in the last 24 hours about this being illegal, immoral, and wrong. And so there is a vacuum of leadership both here and there. So it proves that we are one big happy family on both sides of the ocean. Frank, let me come back to you on this question of annexation in the West Bank, because that to me was a sort of hidden Easter egg in a Jewish context, I guess, Easter egg in the midst of the comments last night. This, I'll have more to say on that in 4 weeks, and 4 weeks was an odd time frame, right? It means just after the conclusion of the 6 weeks of the first phase. What do you read that to mean? Do you think we are going to see some form of acceptance of this administration of a declaration of Israeli sovereignty over, let's say, Area C, or at least the areas that weren't in the first Trump plan? And what do you think that does to the UAE and to the Abraham Accords, let alone to the prospects of there being something further with Saudi?
Well, first of all, I think one of the things that everybody needs to understand from this is just how easy it is for Netanyahu to manipulate the Trump administration. I think they had expectations that Trump might really push them on the ceasefire going into this. I think they were concerned about what kind of language Trump was going to use. Is he going to say we can't allow Hamas to stay in power? At the end of the day, Trump went way further than I think even the Israelis dared to dream. I was watching a replay of the news conference yesterday. I was just struck by how happy Netanyahu looked. I don't ever think Trump really has any idea just how neuralgic that concept is over in the Middle East. I don't think he gets the fact that the Palestinians have lived on that land for generations, if not in some cases hundreds of years. They've been displaced on multiple occasions, and they have absolutely no intention of leaving Gaza. Nor is Egypt going to give up sovereign territory to create some new city for the Palestinians. Jordan is certainly not going to do that. I was trying to figure out how to put this in their own language. It's like after the LA fires, if Netanyahu came here and said, hey, everybody in LA should move to Saskatchewan, right? I mean, there's just no real world chance that any of that is going to work. So the question is, what are you being asked to look at, right? So that he can do something else when you're not paying attention. And in my mind, Jeremy, as you suggested, that is annexation. And I think that there's a political way in which that plays out to Netanyahu's benefit. And I don't think it was coincidental that 4 weeks more or less coincides with the end of the ceasefire there, because you can very easily see Bibi going in and saying, hey, look, I'm happy to have a negotiation here, but at the end of 42 days, I'm going to lose my coalition, and then I'm going to have to go to elections, and God only knows what will happen after that. So if you're Trump and you say, well, hey, what about if I offered annexation? Or Bibi, knowing him after literally spending more time with him than my wife during the Obama administration, he'll say something like, oh yeah, I want to find peace, but of course I got to have my politics. So maybe if you did something on annexation, I could keep Smotrich in my coalition, keep my government in place, and then move all of this forward. So yeah, my guess is, and I don't think they've made a decision on this, but my guess is you'll be looking at annexation, obviously not have anything related to Area A or B, and certainly not all of Area C. But I think you could be looking at annexation of some of the major settlement blocks. I think certainly the ones east of the west of the barrier, rather, would be an easy one for them to do politically, probably there and here. Oh, what I would be concerned about is if you start getting into Bethel and some of the other the bigger settlements on the other side of the barrier. You really are destroying even the pretense of having a two-state solution. What impact would that have on the Emiratis? My guess is that they would not withdraw from the Abraham Accords, nor would Bahrain or Morocco. I think that they would more or less stay in place, but I just don't think you'll be able to advance that with the Saudis at this point. I think the politics of the region now are such that Trump is viewed as almost so far in the bag with Netanyahu that the U.S. just has no credibility. It's just not for bin Salman. He's got his own politics, and so do all the other leaders there. Everybody in that region, literally to a man, is like, this is a horrible idea. It'll never ever happen. We can't allow this to go forward. And so just the politics of normalization with Israel just really shifted further and further away from where we all thought we might have been a few days ago. So again, it's one of those things where Trump has really shot himself in the foot with this. There's absolutely no reason for him to go that far. He could have. The Saudis want to do a normalization deal. They were really sort of looking for a way to make that work for the Palestinians. They meeting, with Hussein al-Sheikh and Majid Faraj in Saudi Arabia last week with Trump's folks, and I think that there were some leaks in the Israeli press to the effect that Saudi might be willing to put out a statement talking about how they're prepared to move forward with annexation. I'm sorry, with normalization. I just think all that stuff is off the table right now, and I think in some ways Trump has walked into a mess that he didn't even really fully intend to walk into. And so now you see folks walking that back a little bit. Lindsey Graham was like, it's funny to watch Republicans squirm when Trump says really crazy stuff, because they're kind of like, well, yeah, I don't think we're really going to be sending troops over there, but that's a great idea if you could make it work. At the end of the day, this has zero traction as a policy proposition, but I think it really does tee us up to permit Israeli annexation and really move forward with a bunch of things that are going to kill Saudi normalization and make a two-state solution impossible. So that's what I took away from that press conference. Is I try not to listen to too much of the crazy stuff Trump says. I try to look at what it means for the policy, and I think that there were some really very disconcerting elements of what the impact of all of this.
So Todd, what do you think? I mean, if Frank is correct, then the Emiratis who made the Abraham Accords contingent on there not being annexation would, in Frank's analysis, would be okay with now 4+ years later moving forward with annexation. Is that your read of the situation? I don't know if you follow closely the Gulf reactions.
Well, it's not my expertise, but I think interest always overcome, the ideology. So at this point, there are very deep economic and security connections between Israel and the Emirati, and I'm not sure they would want to give that up because of annexation. And again, Frank is an expert, but in my intuition, Trump could also go, it could, backlash at some point on Israel. I mean, we could see I could envision a situation in which President Trump goes to Saudi Arabia, I don't know when, in the upcoming weeks, and they come and say, well, listen, this is not the deal. This is not going to bring you the Nobel Prize. This is not going to give you the contract. So, he might try to reposition this, and then at least some of the people in Israel are thinking that both the annexation and the displacement are just like goats that are put in there in order to take them out when you actually have the real deal with the Saudis. Again, we can't predict anything. We can't even predict where the ceasefire agreement is going because it's the Middle East and it's so shaky, and we don't know what can happen in the West Bank, and we don't know what can happen in Gaza. And how that will impact everything. But I'm under the impression that if the Emiratis did not break up relations with Israel after the 7th of October, then I don't see them breaking up relations after, even if there is some kind of annexation, even though it is supposedly violating the Abraham Accords.
Well, just if I could very quickly on that, and I agree with all of that, but the Emiratis said when they agreed to normalize relations with Israel, it was that Israel has agreed not to annex the West Bank for some period of time, right? And if that period of time is 4 years or whatever, I don't think anyone is going to say like, oh, gee, we thought it was 5 years or whatever it was. And I think your analysis is exactly right. There's a lot of interest they have in moving forward. Also, the Emiratis don't really have the same kind of politics that the Saudis have. That's a tiny little country with respect to their own indigenous population and any anger they may feel on the street there. So I think they're in a slightly different situation than the Saudis who, and you're exactly right. You never know with Trump. He's gonna listen to the last person that he talked to on this. The one thing that I would take away from it though is that I just find it extremely difficult to imagine Trump pressuring Netanyahu in any meaningful way to move to phase two. And I would just want to stress what phase two is: a complete withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza and a permanent end to the war. Right. And so I think, as we focus on how crazy Trump is, we also shouldn't take our attention away from the fact that there is a substantive issue that needs to be resolved here, which is what is going to happen to Hamas even if you were to move from phase one to phase two right now. What would be the ultimate disposition of Hamas there? And is anybody in Israel really going to be willing to allow Hamas to remain intact militarily, which they are more or less? So now that's a question others can answer. But the one thing I can say is I find it impossible to imagine, no matter what the Saudis tell Trump, that Trump's going to pressure Netanyahu to move to a full withdrawal of the IDF and a permanent end to that war while Hamas is still intact. It's just that's just inconsistent with the whole way the Republicans and Trump himself are going to view this issue.
So just to dig in a little bit more deeply, because there's been a couple of questions in the Q&A about, what are the near-term scenarios, then what is likely to happen. So we've got about 3+ weeks left in phase one, right? And negotiations on going to phase two technically are considered to have started by virtue of, I guess, Witkoff talking to Netanyahu in the White House. So we are in that phase of negotiation. We don't think there's going to be pressure from Trump on Netanyahu to make the kinds of gestures or concessions that would be needed in order to get to where, Frank has indicated phase two needs to be. So what does that mean on day 42? One scenario, Frank, you mentioned was as long as talks are continuing, then the ceasefire holds, but hostages don't come home then, right? They stay.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Exactly.
what Netanyahu is planning to do, I don't know if it'll work, but what he was planning to do is basically to extend phase one
Yeah.
and continue negotiations on the remaining hostages that were supposed to be in phase two in exchange for very heavy prisoners, the big names that weren't released yet. Very difficult release of prisoners, but without the withdrawal. And the withdrawal of the IDF forces, specifically from Philadelphia, that's a symbol. That is something that Netanyahu's coalition and base will not be able to contain. So what Netanyahu wants to do is to send his team and to try and reach an agreement with Hamas on extending phase one. They say, again, it's not necessary, it might be wishful thinking, but and again, we don't know what these statements are going to do to the dynamics of the
That's what I was going to
negotiation.
ask. Yeah, exactly.
But at least before Trump's statement yesterday, what Netanyahu's people were saying was, Hamas doesn't even know where all the hostages are, especially the bodies. So they also wouldn't want to conclude phase two because they can't actually deliver. So in that case, both sides have an interest to extend phase one, bring back more hostages, at least the alive ones, at least those that are still alive, which in phase two is between 20 to 24 from what we know, that will be left for phase two. But again, that is based on a lot of assumptions regarding Hamas that A, might not be true, and B, I don't know if they stand after what happened yesterday. And when Trump starts talking about displacement and the U.S. taking over Gaza, then what is the incentive of Hamas even to continue negotiations? I don't know.
Frank, a really good question just popped into the Q&A, which I was just thinking myself. In the midst of all of this, none of us in 37 minutes has mentioned the word Iran, which is kind of astonishing because if you have a BB visit to Washington, D.C., and you haven't mentioned Iran in the first 37 minutes, you know that something else is going on in the world. So maybe just take a moment. I mean, did you see or hear anything out of the meeting yesterday regarding discussion on Iran? Is there any clarity as to what the Trump team has apparently been open to diplomacy with Iran, and what was Bibi's message? Either one of you. I mean, Frank, I'll go to you first, but I'd love to get Iran into the conversation here.
Yeah, that's a great question. If I'll just finish really quickly on the Gaza ceasefire. I think what Netanyahu will demand as a condition for moving from phase 1 to phase 2 is the demilitarization of Gaza, but also the exile of the Hamas leadership from Gaza, which is something that they've offered in the past. We'll give you safe passage out of there if you'll basically lay your weapons down. I just think people need to take a second and understand, as distasteful as it may be, how all this looks from the Hamas perspective, right? And those hostages are the last guarantee that they have that they're going to be able to remain intact, if not in power, going forward. So they're not going to release those last group of hostages unless they have some kind of guarantees that Israel isn't just going to resume the war all over again. So the idea that maybe the Israelis can just buy Hamas off with a whole bunch more of Palestinian prisoners, maybe Barghouti or some of the really high value guys, I just don't see that as being something that Hamas is going to be interested in pursuing. So yeah, I think the most likely scenario here is that we're neither at war nor do we have the deal move from phase 1 to phase 2 at the end of 42 days. We could move into an extended sort of interregnum there. If there was one positive element of this, and I think, Jeremy, this might have been what you're getting at about the news conference yesterday, I expected more bellicose rhetoric out of President Trump on Iran. I thought that there was going to be the threat of military force much more explicit than it had been before. I know if there was a pipe dream of the Israeli right coming out of this meeting, it was that Trump would say, hey, Iran, if you don't do X, Y, or Z immediately, we're going to authorize a military strike on your nuclear facilities. He knew Trump wasn't going to go that far, but I think he would have ideally had a stronger statement out of Trump in terms of willingness to use military force. In fact, Trump really focused on the maximum pressure, which is basically sanctions, and then certainly left the door open for a deal there. And again, Trump's narrative is he's a peacemaker. He's an ender of wars, right? So again, I don't think he's going to force the Israelis into phase 2 of the negotiations, but I also don't think he wants to see that war resume. And I really don't think he wants to go to war with Iran if he can avoid it. So I think that if anything, there's probably a clearer path towards some kind of a diplomatic resolution on Iran than there was previously. But again, all that remains to be seen, and it's all subject to change every 5 minutes down the block.
I think that Netanyahu, well, I know Netanyahu was a bit disappointed from the approach on Iran. He won't say it because, he has, it's disguised by all of the joy over the Gaza Riviera plan. But Netanyahu's plan, basically priorities from this meeting, was first Iran, and he thought that from Iran, the Saudi Arabia thing will come into fruition, and then only latest would be Gaza. And basically Trump did exactly the opposite. He started from Gaza, that moves into Saudi Arabia, and only at the end is Iran. So and Netanyahu really was already, and Israelis have been briefing for months that we're preparing to attack Iran the minute Trump enters office. So Netanyahu will not disclose that, but in closed, some of his people in closed doors are saying, well, that's not exactly what we're expecting. Again, they got other gifts, so he has something to come home with, so it's okay. But at the end of the day, Netanyahu really, one of his plans for the next election, before it goes to the next election, one of the things he wanted to do is kind of strike Iran and have that as the last legacy ticket for the next election. At this point, and again, this could change in a minute, it doesn't seem that's going to happen with President Trump.
Frank, let me shift to ask you something that's a little bit more political domestically here. There's obviously a lot for Democrats to be paying attention to and to be pushing back on, trying to shine a spotlight on just what the choice that Americans made in November means for their lives, right? And probably the Gaza announcement is not one of the things that Democrats are going to choose to elevate and make a big deal about because it's not a voting issue for folks. But what is your advice to Democrats on the Hill about responding to last night? I mean, do you see a benefit from a united Democratic approach to just say, this is, illegal, immoral, bad for our national interests? This is not the right direction. We have a better direction, and maybe claim the mantle of normalization and, what I call the 23-state solution to try to say that we've got a better way? Do you see a political reason for Democrats to try to do that, or are we just going to hear silence basically from the Hill?
Well, I think it's very important that people step up and say this is not remotely acceptable to the United States. But, and again, this is just my own personal approach to it. I find getting really, really spun up about all the crazy stuff Trump said is sort of playing into his hands, because that way everybody, everybody gets angry and goes down on the floor. And meanwhile, he's shutting down the entire federal government. So, again, this is a matter, you understand the politics of this far better than I do, Jeremy. I think your statement was appropriately extremely strong. But I wouldn't put a lot of political capital into getting Democrats to stand up and make a big deal out of this right now. I think that there's been just widespread sense from Republicans of like, this isn't never going to work. The idea of sending U.S. troops to Gaza is so ridiculous that I don't think it's a serious proposition in any way, form, or fashion. So I think the kind of strong statement you put out last night, I'm sure there's Democrats on the Hill who will stand up and say something, similarly passionately. But I wouldn't spend a week talking about, there's just no real world scenario. And with the U.S. has not sending troops, so we can't deport 2 million Palestinians, even if we wanted to. And incidentally, neither can the Israelis, right? So and no one's going to take them in Jordan or Egypt. Like the whole thing it's a complete non-starter in every way, form, or fashion. So I would say strong message, no, that's absolutely unacceptable. But then I wouldn't play Trump's game of getting really spun up on this, because while you're doing that, he's doing even crazier stuff, actually, practically.
By the way, I just want to remind folks that we have now started to put out some of our thoughts on all of these issues through a Substack called Word on the Street. I'm just going to ask Eliza to put that link. Oh, I think you just did. That was perfect timing from Eliza. She just put that in the chat as I was beginning to say that. And so, we will be sharing thoughts about things like the 23-state solution and what does that actually look like, and what are our reactions to things like last night's comments on that Substack. Tal, what do you see now when Netanyahu returns home? What is the lay of the land in Israeli politics? You've sort of indicated that you think that his coalition is stabilized. Is there any chance that there's going to be somebody stepping forward with a little bit stronger of a voice about what has happened over the course of the last 18 months and how this is all part of really a disastrous tenure, and stepping forward to say that it's time for a change now? Or are we really just stuck for the next year and 3 quarters?
We're really just stuck for the next year and 3 quarters. Or also, we've been analyzing for months the threat of the Haredi conscription and draft bill. Well, it seems right now there might not be a bill, but they also are not going to give up the heavy budgeting and funding they can get in the next budget that is supposed to be approved by March. It could be that the 2026 budget will not pass, and that will lead to elections in the summer, but that's not much earlier than they're supposed to be anyway in November 2026. I think that Netanyahu is probably now at his strongest point since October 7th. First of all, he has a very wide coalition, it's 68 seats. In many ways, Gideon Sa'ar joining the government, even though it was very much criticized, I think it has much to, you can attribute a lot to Gideon Sa'ar joining the government, to the fact that there was a hostage deal to begin with. He's not credited enough in Israel, but without Gideon Sa'ar joining the government, this wouldn't have happened, because Netanyahu couldn't contain Ben Gvir leaving. But now you already have Ben Gvir wanting to run back. So the big threats were like Trump, the conscription, and the budget. And it seems like he's going to pass all of them. And he's just going to stay stable. And once again, there's only one person in Israel who decides when elections are held, and that's the prime minister himself. At least that's the way it has been in the past 15, 16 years. Elections are never forced on him. He decides when it's comfortable for him to go to elections. And not enough time has passed from the 7th of October for him to rewrite a campaign. But if you look at his Twitter account today and you see the video that he posted today, you can see that his election campaign actually started yesterday at the White House. and that Trump is going to be, as he was in the past, a major part of Netanyahu's campaign whenever the elections happen.
Frank, I want to also ask you a domestic political question, which has come up a few times in the Q&A, which is all of this, these things that Trump does one day after day now, is this all a bait and switch? I mean, is it all a matter of distraction to just put so many things out there that we don't see what Elon Musk is doing, that we don't understand exactly what the threats are? Do you see it in that context that we just shouldn't take a lot of these things individually as seriously because they're all part of a smokescreen?
Well, yeah, that's a broad characterization of it. I think it's very important that people remain vigilant about all the various anti-democratic initiatives that Trump is undertaking. But yeah, I do think that he's got a long time-tested strategy of just throwing a million crazy things out there, and then one outrage is replaced by the next the following day, and in the end, everybody is just left reacting to him in every single news cycle. So yeah, I do think that the real Trump agenda is domestic here. I think he'd like to get a Nobel Prize for normalization, for which beyond that, I don't think he cares at all about what goes on in the Middle East here. So yeah, again, just my own personal perspective, keep your eye on the ball here, right? And the real ball for Trump is eviscerating our federal government, right? And he's given Musk the opportunity to do that, which is just absurd. But the one thing I would say is the ball here is annexation. So you talked about up on Capitol Hill, right? And so now, of course, everybody should express outrage on all this. But I think what you should really pivot to is, hey, hang on a second. The president said he might authorize Israeli annexation of the West Bank, which is the death of the two-state solution, right? In a month, right? That, as I said before, that will coincide with the end of the ceasefire, so I can see the outlines of a deal that Trump gives Bibi to buy off Smotrich or everything. But I think on Capitol, it remains incredibly important that people keep focused on that question, because that is the substantive issue. Trump does not have the power to do anything he's talking about doing in Gaza Strip right now. It's incredibly unfortunate that he would even say anything like that. But that's not a policy. That's not a real world policy. Any hope that he might pressure Netanyahu on the ceasefire, I think, is probably gone by the wayside. But the policy is annexation. And so I would just, if keeping your eye on the ball, I would tell my friends on Capitol Hill, hey, listen to what the little words there matter a lot. And we got to start making very clear right now that annexation, if you're thinking of signing off on Israeli annexation of significant parts of Area C inside of 30 days, you will have a mountain of problems politically with that. And Republicans on Capitol Hill, they'll back up Trump. No one wants to fight with him. But annexation is something that a lot of folks aren't really that, politically, there's a very small constituency for that. I mean, obviously some of the evangelicals will do whatever Israel wants, but I think that you're not going to get a whole lot of strong support for, annexation by Israel and for the settlers going haywire in the West Bank. So again, that would be what I would make sure folks on the Hill were thinking about, in addition to expressing obviously deep condemnation of what the president said. That's the policy ball right now.
Terrific. And we're coming towards the end of the hour, so I want to give you each a chance to say anything you haven't had a chance to get in yet on Tal. I saw you wanting to get in there on what Frank was saying, so I'll turn to you first, and then Frank.
No. I just want to say that, with keeping the eye on the ball is something that we've been saying in Israel for the past, I don't know, how long has this government been in power? 2.5 years. And there's such a striking similarity between, the very ultra right-wing government Israel has and the very berserk government administration that the US have. And I feel looking from afar, I feel like this is like our right-wing government revolution, judiciary overhaul, just like on steroids. It seems like you're just going through what we went through in January 2023 till October 2023 on steroids. And by the way, it is still going on. I mean, the government is still trying to undermine the Israeli democracy with either in the judicial system, either in the media, and just this is an important discussion for us to make, to have and continue to have, just because I think the liberals are under attack in both countries, and only if we preserve the alliance and not only preserve it, but actually strengthen it, it makes at least it makes you feel better like a good Jew that everyone is suffering and not only you. I mean, it's not only bad in Israel, it's also bad in the US, and you can always think, well, it's not only bad here, it's also bad in Israel. But it is very important to continue the dialogue and to look and to learn from experience, even though, you know, the systems are so different. But at the end of the day, we are dealing with populist leaders using media, using mass media, and using social media, and using technology. Of course, not in the same magnitude. Netanyahu would only dream to have Elon Musk, but is on his side. But it's very important for us to continue to have this conversation. I'm happy I had the chance to do it with you too.
Thank you, Tal. Frank, final words for us. I just want to also mention to everybody that I'm really pleased that Frank is doing some policy analysis work for the J Street Policy Center. His analysis of this meeting and some other pieces are available on our Policy Center website, and we'll continue to have those flowing out regularly. So Frank, close us out with some final words.
I'll leave it right where Tal did. I thought that was a beautiful description of the situation that we're in right now. Bibi and Trump are very much birds of a feather, and yeah, it is a disconcerting thought to think we're just the beginning of the mess you guys have been dealing with over there for a couple of years now. So yeah, difficult times ahead, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you both for being with us. Thank you to everybody who joined us and who's watching us later. J Street will continue to be your political home in these troubling times. We will be fighting for our democracy. We'll be fighting against the worst anti-democratic authoritarian tendencies of President Trump, and we will be fighting alongside Tal, hand in hand with many people in Israel, for a democratic and secure national home of the Jewish people, and alongside a national homeland and state for the Palestinian people. I believe it will be part of a regional comprehensive deal along the lines of what Frank has been talking about, the Saudi normalization plan, and we will continue to work towards those goals. So thank you all very much for joining us. We'll see you soon.